Well, this is kind of an appropriate year to do this. It is the Chinese Year of the Dog, and it's not going to come around for another 12 years, so I can, after 12 years, I figure I can do the same thing, and you'll have forgotten. Or maybe there'll be new information. But first, I need to do a little survey out here. How many of you, when you were growing up as a child, there was a dog or dogs in your household? Raise your hand. Okay, well, and how about during your middle years, maybe you were raising a family and so forth, or even if you weren't raising a family, in your middle adult years, there was a dog in your household. Now, the key question here is, how many do you have a dog in your household now? Yeah, we know it's a responsibility, and time, it takes a lot of time. But I bet during all those times you had dogs, you didn't really give a lot of thought about where they came from or what are they doing here. You just sort of took dogs for granted. And that's pretty much what the rest of the world did too, because until about 30 years ago, if you looked at the scientific research, there was almost nothing about dogs. Oh, they'd study cows, they'd study horses, but they wouldn't study dogs because dogs are just there. So my talk is going to cover the following. How did dogs evolve and what's unique about it? Although dogs evolved directly from wolves, why they are not wolves. It's a distinct difference. I'm going to talk about how dogs were viewed in the ancient civilizations of India, Greece, the Romans, the Egyptians. Then as we follow into human civilization that goes around, I'll talk about some of the uses of dogs, how dogs shifted from somewhat limited capacity to be more utilitarian in a number of functions. And then I'm going to talk about dog breeds. It's a recent phenomenon. The dog breeds as we know them today is really an artifact of the mid-19th century. It's more about form than function, although there certainly is a good thing about some of the breeding. And then I'm going to talk about the senses of dogs and why they really know more about you than we know about them. And then, if I've got time, I'll take you a trip through one dog breed, which went from one time being the most intensely bred dog to being a dog out of time. It involves slavery, hunting, emperors, revolution, and even Hollywood. So then I'm going to end with a little Rudyard Kipling, and then I'll give you a 1-minute tour of why I like my dogs. First, let me kind of say an extraordinary, what might seem an extraordinary statement. Second only to humans, dogs are the smartest and most successful animal on the planet. So, so it started about 45 to 50,000 years ago when a bunch of somewhat lazy Eurasian gray wolves saw the handwriting on the wall. The alpha predator had arrived. And you're going to have to bear with me for a moment. This is Paleolithic man. When Paleolithic humans arrived on the North American continent, there were no other humans, but there was a large population of what they call megafauna, giant ground sloths, mastodons, mammoths, saber-toothed cats. In a remarkably short period of time, they disappeared. Same thing happened in Australia when humans arrived on that continent. It happened in Madagascar. It happened in Asia shortly after humans arrived. We're not talking a year or two, we're talking a couple thousand years, but even that's amazing. And it did not happen in Africa because humans evolved with the animals in Africa, but we're certainly doing it to the African megafauna now. When the Europeans arrived on the North American continent, the largest single species herds of animals, the American bison, occupied the continent, estimated to be 20 to 30 million strong. The killing stopped when there was about 1,000 left. Same thing for the American passenger pigeon. They said the skies would darken for an hour or two as the flocks flew over. There may have been as many as 3 to 5 billion of these birds. The last one died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. They named her Martha. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. There's twice as many tigers in captivity in just the United States as exist in the wild today. Whales. Now, the largest creature ever to have existed on this planet is the blue whale. Up to 110 feet long and 200 tons, bigger than the biggest dinosaurs. Up until about 1960, it was not unusual to see whale meat as an ingredient in canned dog food. So the question is, why is it that there's estimated by some sources to be as many as 900 million to 1 billion dogs living on our planet today, and they live right amongst us. And 3/4 of those dogs don't have an owner. They're not hiding from us, they're right there. So let's go back to the wolves. When Paleolithic man started entering Eurasia and the northern climes where the gray wolves were, it was what you would call an uneasy relationship, because you had predators facing a predator. But there was a lot of similarities. Both packs of wolves and groups of humans consisted of closely related individuals. Both groups depended upon cooperation within the group to be able to survive. And that cooperation required a high level of communication between the individuals to coordinate that survival. This is my point here. Also, within that communication, there's a hierarchy of leadership in both the human groups and the wolf packs. And interesting enough, they both were intolerant of outsiders. Outsiders were not welcome, whether it was humans or wolves, and they were driven off or they would have been killed. But from time to time, both groups let in outsiders. It seems like there was this subconscious recognition that too much inbreeding leads to a weakening of the whole system. So it's kind of like immigration, anyone? And also, well, another example would be the fact that 2% of the human genes somehow seems to be Neanderthal. So there was a mixing. But being a predator is really tough. It's oftentimes very marginal whether you survive or not survive. Well, one thing about humans, as the wolves noticed right away, was we're messy. We leave refuse and garbage, and some of that is edible. And so some of the less, and remember, this is a natural world 45, 50,000 years ago. The humans were just another animal on the planet interacting with everybody else. And so the wolves would be saying, whoa, I've got some free lunch here, and not specifically that they were preying on humans, because actually even though the weapons weren't sophisticated, the Paleolithic weapons were certainly sufficient to fight off wolves. And it would have been true that really aggressive wolves would have been driven off, where the less aggressive wolves would just be kind of hovering in the background. But it's also true that some percentage of humans really are interested in animals just for the animal's sake, and so they'd be paying attention to them. Also, what the humans would have noticed, when the wolves were around, other predators were not. And also, it was like an early warning system. And if the wolves were acting up and howling or something like that, and they're paying close attention to them because it was a much closer to with animal life with humans then, that they're kind of handy to have around. And if those wolves were not being aggressive toward them, you know, every once in a while someone might say, well, let's throw the wolf a bone. But one of the, and so still science figures, well, this could go on for just years and years and years, this kind of parallel life. But one of the keys to what might have moved wolves, relatively unaggressive wolves around humans, into another species comes from the Russian fox breeding experiments. In 1959, some Russian scientists took a large group of foxes, which are distantly related to wolves, and ran a breeding program. They bred the least aggressive foxes to the least aggressive foxes. Then they ran another program with the more aggressive ones of those, and then they had sort of a random kind of control group. And this has been carried on for over 40 generations, and in fact, it may still be running today. But what they noticed after just a few generations, the offspring of the unaggressive foxes started showing up with floppy ears. Their tails, instead of going behind them, actually went up in the air and curled over their back. They started barking as opposed to that. And the big key was when, now there was no other contact other than feeding these foxes. There was no other interaction with these foxes. Is that when they entered the building where the aggressive ones were bred together, the foxes would retreat to the back of the cage, snarl and show their teeth and so forth, and no sticking your fingers in that cage. But on the unaggressive foxes, the foxes would actually, when the humans came into the building, foxes would go to the front of the cage and make eye contact. And it got to the point where after a few more generations that they actually could open the cage and handle the foxes like a pet. So what's within that sort of wolf-dog genome is that lack of aggression creates sort of a friendliness. And over the these interactions between the wolves and the dogs was happening, here, there, and everywhere. And sometimes it took, sometimes it didn't. But over about 20,000, 30,000 years, protodogs had arrived. So when humans came into the North America 14,000 years ago, dogs came with them because there was no dogs in North America. And the genome of the dog matches almost perfectly with the Eurasian gray wolf. It doesn't match up with the American timber wolf at all. So dogs came with them. Also, excavations of Paleolithic graves, and this one's dated to about 12,000 years ago. It's actually, if you can figure it out, I had a hard time making it out, but anyway, it's a skeleton of a woman, and her arms are clasped around the skeleton of a small dog. So by that time, there was populations of these dogs that were within the human societies. But, so, there's an old saying, if you can't lick them, join them. Dogs took it to the next level. They joined them and then continued to lick them. Now, let me talk a little bit about the difference between the wolves and the dogs. The genome of the dog and the Eurasian gray wolf is about 99.5%, and yet they're not wolves. It's a little bit like saying chimpanzees and gorillas are 99% of human, and we're not gorillas or chimpanzees. And as a bit of a trivia thing, the dog genome matches up with the humans by about 84%. But if you're a cat lover, believe it or not, the cat matches up closer to 90%. So go figure on that one. So, okay, let me get this. Okay. Well, so from a physical standpoint, this is a breed called the Malamute. That looks pretty wolf-like. You say, oh yeah, I can see that one. coming on. These are not wolves. This is not a wolf. And these are not wolves. And these are the village feral dogs, and that's 3/4 of the dogs that exist in the world. Look pretty much like that. Little heavier coat when they go the northern climes. And these guys weigh about 25, 35 pounds. And if you've traveled a lot, you've probably been in villages and so forth where there's these populations of dogs. I'm going to talk more about them later. Another difference with wolves is despite everybody assumes this, dogs are pack animals. Not technically. Wolves are pack animals, what I was talking about earlier about what a pack is. Dogs are social animals, and they will form groups, but they don't form these organized units that act together, that communicate. They're kind of friendly toward one another, and then they'll go their separate ways. Dogs bark, wolves do not. Another thing is that the wolf brain is about 20% larger than the dog. And so some experiments done, actually this century, not this century, the one just before, but where, testing the intelligence of animals. And one of the tests is whether animals can work together to solve a problem, get a treat. Can they work together? And it's been shown that certain apes can work together and that type of thing. Well, it turns out wolves are pretty good at this. In fact, they're much better at solving the problem than dogs. So wolves are smarter than dogs. Well, yes and no. Wolves are really smart wolves. But when they started looking at the videotapes of the experiment, the wolves, when presented with a problem, the wolves would kind of interact with each other and well, it turned out that if the dogs couldn't solve it very quickly, they just sort of sat down or they stood there and they looked at the humans around them and said, hey, you with the big brain, help me out here. So, and in one sense, they didn't need that extra brain tissue, which is kind of energy consuming, and they've actually co-opted humans to get what they want. And if you think about the way pets are treated now, I think the dogs have been pretty successful at that. And then one other one. One thing, dogs are promiscuous, if you want us to call it that way. Female dogs come into heat on a regular basis after they've had puppies 8, 10, 12 weeks. Get out of here, kids. You're on your own. With wolves, what happens when there's pups, the breeding female, usually there's only one breeding female within the pack, the whole sexual apparatus shuts down within the pack. The actual sexual apparatus within the dog starts shrinking. The testosterone goes down because it takes anywhere up to 2 years to raise a wolf pup to be a fully functioning member of the pack. They don't have the energy or the time to be able to be raising multiple pups. So it's a slower maturing thing. So, okay, well this is a plaque from Assyria, as you can see. Oh good, the picture looks pretty good up there. I wasn't sure whether it would translate. In the ancient world, dogs were seen as companions, hunters, guardians, and part of the family. Well, that's not too different than what they are now. But they tended to be just kind of two types, usually hunting and guardian types. But the attitude toward dogs, actually you can see where there's a collar and a leash, and those actually were invented by either the Egyptians or the Assyrians in terms of probably around 3000 BC, 2500, 3000 BCE. I wanted to read an epic from India. This is epic, the Mahabharata. It's next to Gilgamesh in terms of these big epics. Within that, there was a story of King Yudhisthira. He was getting old and he knew his time was limited. So he went on a journey to the gates of paradise. And along that journey, he took his family, and his dog came along. Well, it was a long and arduous journey, and the family members either left or they died on the way. So when King Yudhisthira arrived at the gates, it was just him and his dog. And the guardians of the gate said, "Ah, King, you have led an honorable life. You are welcome to into paradise. However, you cannot bring your dog." The king took a step back. He was shocked. His loyal companion that saw him all the way to these gates, and he told the guardians, I reject your paradise, because if it means I go to hell, then so be it. The guardians then said, that was your last test, and that your dog is welcome into the gates of paradise. Now, dogs, there was sort of a spiritual component and association with death, with this is Egypt, and these are dog mummies. And you always think of dogs or the animals being within the pharaohs and that kind of thing. Well, there was lots of smaller ones, and oftentimes buried with humans, but there were, believe it or not, pet cemeteries, because these dog mummies are kind of all over the place. So it turns out that if Egyptians were well enough off, they actually could have their dog mummified, and they go ahead and do it. It's a little bit like, I'm not sure if it's nowadays we clone our dogs, and oftentimes dogs were buried with their owners upon death to assist them in the afterlife. And this is from about 2500 or 3500 BCE. These are BCE. These are a lot of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And guess who that is? That's Anubis, the dog jackal god who guided the soul to the hall of truth. And this is there was something about dogs that were associated with death. And here's Cerberus. This is actually only two heads, but sometimes Cerberus was not just a three-headed dog. The guardian of the gates of hell in Greek mythology. In Plato's Republic, in the dialogue, Socrates called the dog the true philosopher and could distinguish between friend and enemy and was a lover of learning. Plato referred to the dog as a beast worthy of wonder. And here's a more beautiful, those Greek vases were just kind of incredible. And here's a hunting scene of ancient Greece. It looks like that's a wild boar. Here's a modern day hunting scene. I think we have a little contrast here of what's really hunting and what's just show for the humans. And then the Romans, of course, dogs went along with a lot of their marbles and so forth. And also, again, this is a dog tomb from in the Roman Empire. And oftentimes, Rome saw the dogs as the guardian of the home. Virgil wrote that with dogs never fear the midnight thief. They were also seen to protect from the supernatural. So some dogs were buried beneath after they died, buried beneath the threshold of the home to protect the home from the supernatural. They were also mentioned in Roman law as guardians of the home and the flock. This is a Roman mosaic, and any guesses as to what it says? Beware of the dog. That's right, beware of the dog. So even then, they were rather fancy on the sign. Now, China, they were used for hunting and companions, and a lot of the smaller breeds come from the breeding that was done, and the upper classes had their little lap dogs and so forth like that. However, they are also used for food. And in today, China, Southeast Asia, and Korea, there are dog farms, and it's basically they're dog meat farms. And there's literally in South Korea a couple thousand of them. And however, the younger generation seems to not have quite the same taste for dog meat as the others. So it's one of those things where it's fading out, but it's still relatively common. But at the same time, dogs were seen as a gift from heaven, and their blood was sacred. So now even the Mayans, they had their dogs, and but these are going to be small dogs. They're going to be the 25 to 30 pound dogs, but they were also seen as guardians and pets, but also for food. But they were thought to convey the soul of the dead to the afterlife. And the same thing with the Aztecs. Aztecs also, because they were living close, had a similar view of dogs as the guide to the afterlife. And taking it forward a bit, it's kind of interesting, is that in 1758, Linnaeus, I'm not sure how the pronunciation, was categorizing all dogs and put wolves and jackals and dogs into the Canis classification. And he labeled dogs as Canis familiaris. Well, on the surface, it certainly looks like the familiar wolf. But actually, if you take the word familiar, it can mean a familiar is a spirit that lives within the body of an animal that is closely associated with humans. So really, up through the old civilizations, before perhaps maybe Christianity and some of the more modern religions, there is a whole spirit aspect to dogs that the civilizations believed in, both in mythology in terms of the afterlife, but there was a real commonality across civilizations, even though they were separated, just like the Mesoamericans, of the dogs being guides to the afterlife. So what happened is that, in a way, dogs in mythology, as human civilization went forward, kind of mythology gave way to practicality. And so, and also there was, by this time, humans had a lot of experience in breeding various domestic animals. And so dogs were bred to perform certain functions. This is a cart dog, so they're going to be low to the ground, stocky, and even if you've heard of Rottweilers, a guard dog, actually it was bred as a cart dog. Used as transportation, up in the north, and really dog sledding was well into use before the Aleuts and Eskimos and so forth got their powered ski-doos or whatever they use, ski mobiles. But, and of course, herding dogs. This happens to be Peter, an Aussie, because it doesn't have a tail. And so what happens, dogs were types. They weren't bred to be anything specific. And so form followed function, because obviously a cart dog's going to be stocky, a guard dog's going to be a little bigger. A dog that was a rat or whatever is going to be small in order to get into small places. So in roughly the 1850s, 1860s, these started, dog shows. It started in Britain. And where suddenly dogs became something other than function, they became form. How many of you actually in the audience have ever been actually to a dog show? So it has its own world, and there's something like the American Kennel Club has about 140, 150 breeds recognized. Well, there's another 100 breeds waiting in the wings, and there's probably another 200 breeds, quote unquote breeds, waiting in the wings to be recognized as something specific and so forth. But people can get kind of carried away with the form here. And to some extent, this is a Doberman picture, and to some extent, this illustrates one of the problems of dog breeds, when the form becomes so narrow, and so the breeders actually will toss out dogs that don't fit that function. They only breed to the dogs that fit this particular form. And if you notice on this Doberman Pinscher, the tail is docked. It was cut when he was a puppy. The tail was lopped off. The ears are also cropped so that it would stand up and look like this. And it has nothing to do with the function of the dog. And many of the breeds nowadays that have been in existence for a while, that have gotten popular, suddenly have a variety of problems. Physical problems, increased cancers, respiratory issues, allergies. And the English Bulldog cannot bear pups in a natural way. They have to be born by cesarean because the head is so distorted to the body by the breeding that it won't fit through the birth canal. So too much of a good thing, you might say. But at the same time, you can say one size does not fit all. And so with these elaborate breeding programs, you really get a dog for various uses. Something you can put in your purse or something that's going to pull you all over the place. So that's, it's a mixed thing. But the reality is all these specialized breeds, and if you walk your dog in the dog park, they're going to say, oh, what kind of dog is that? Well, there's two answers you can give. Well, it's a dog, or you can say it's a mutt, because all these breeds ultimately are mutts. And over the period of time, oftentimes, breeders in the past would take a dog breed, it would start to kind of weaken and have flaws in it. Well, they would throw in other breeds, mix the breeds in with that breed, and then breed back to the dog that was the form that they wanted. But they had to bring in outside. So even though some people may kind of look down their nose today, oh, golden doodles or labradoodles or that kind of thing. Well, that's not a real breed. Well, actually it is, because all of them are like that. Now, let's talk about these guys. And to some degree, it started out way back. These are the scavengers of the human world. They live with humans, and they eat the refuse of humans, and it's not an easy life, for sure. There's a very high mortality rate of the pups because, again, 8, 10 weeks, boom, you're thrown out into the street. Well, it turns out the most successful survival ability or trait on these dogs is to get adopted by a human. And not so much in the way we adopt, but allowed into the household, given extra food, given protection. And these guys are all over the world. They're all over the world. But they still perform the same function they have since the very beginning. And that is feeding on the refuse of humans. And I don't know if you can see that. There's a dog in that picture. And this is a mountain of garbage. This happens to be a city in Africa, but it's these mountains of garbage are elsewhere. And it's I find it kind of a disturbing picture myself, to be honest. But that's, again, that's the way 3/4 of the world's dogs make a living. And the reality is, if suddenly we humans cleaned up their act and didn't have any of this stuff, dogs would kind of disappear. There was a recent article saying that they were having a hard time finding the DNA of the original dogs in some of the older breeds in Mexico and other parts of the country, saying, well, it disappeared. What happened there? Well, when the Europeans came, the Native American populations were just decimated. Or if you were rounded up in Oregon and sent to those camps. Well, without that, the dogs disappeared, you know. And because when they went out into the wild to forage on their own, well, those niches were always taken by much more efficient predators than they had become. Let's see. So, and today, the roles of dogs have changed. We don't use them very much for hunting, for any real necessity. We don't use them for herding very much, but still I think in Australia and New Zealand there's probably used, and border collies are done. But we do use them sort of as guard dogs around the home. Oftentimes people say, get a dog so, you know, it will alert you. But of course we have these new roles. This is obviously the guide dogs for the blind, and I guess we're going to hear more about that in the first part of the afternoon, about how these dogs are trained up. And of course, this is in a cancer ward, providing comfort, because they are open and also they're soft and furry. They provide comfort to those that are mentally disturbed. And they do that because they sense us, they feel us. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And of course this. Believe it or not, that, I guess technically, is a war dog. There's the ones over in Afghanistan or Iraq that sense out the IEDs, and they can sniff them out or warn or alert them to people coming in. But also it's a resource for the soldiers that happen to be over there. In fact, many of the soldiers that come back from these wars with PTSD find that one of the best things that they can do to ease their pain, so to speak, is to have a dog, because the dog is non-judgmental and the soldiers can be fully open to them. Now, what do we got here? We probably one amazing organ here, and this is where we get into why the dogs know more about you. The receptors in the human, with humans, there's about 6 million, odor receptors, about 6 million of them. Dogs is 200 to 300 million, and the hounds, scent hounds, have even more. Dogs can identify you by smell. They can smell identity. They can smell disease. And there's certainly been cases where they can smell cancers. They can smell if you're going to have an epileptic fit. Now, these are specially trained dogs, granted that. They can, but an interesting thing is they can smell time. And have these cases where Rover goes to the door just prior to the owner coming home. Well, one of the keys they thought through experiments, they thought about that, was the fact that they can smell how old the owner's scent is. And if it's repeated on a regularly basis, they know, when it smells like this, it's time to go to the door, because he or she's going to be home at any time. Now, and it's a world that it's like dogs live in a parallel world. I mean, certain things we can kind of say, we can see and we can hear, but we can't smell like this. So they live in this world that is parallel but separate to us. Hearing. Now, the human range is 64 to 23,000 kilohertz. Dogs at 67 to 45,000. Remember the old dog whistles? They blow it and they could. So they can hear it at a level that we can't. They're hearing sounds that we can't hear. And I still remember with my dogs, there was one was upstairs sleeping, zonked out completely. I was downstairs. Another dog came up to me, kind of looking, the eyes. Oh. So I just said quietly, you want a treat? Almost immediately. The dog from upstairs came bounding down the stairs and I just remember thinking at the time, how do you hear that? It wasn't a matter. Okay, the eyes. Now this is again something that's the eyes cycle at about 60 to 65 cycles per second. Dogs are 70 to 80. Remember how dogs really wouldn't pay any attention to TV, the analog TVs? Well, the analog was being broadcast at around 60 cycles per second. Humans could see it as a continuous picture. Well, the dogs, it was as if the picture was in slow motion and it had no interest to them. So dogs will pay a little more attention to these digital TVs now. But their color vision is muted, but it's not completely gone. They're much better sight at night. I don't know if you've taken a flashlight with your dog out in the yard and all of a sudden there's these glowing eyes that's actually a reflective tissue in the back of the eyes, so what available light is in there gets bounced around the eye, so they have a lot more rods than cones in their eyes. And the sight hounds, actually, they have that long, narrow head. The actually eyes are sort of off to the side. It gives them a field of vision of like 270 degrees. So when they're chasing something, they have this, plus the dogs can sense motion a lot better than human beings. So the other thing what dogs do is they read your face. And it turns out if you take a line through human faces, one side of your face, it tends to be the right side, is going to be shows a little, slightly more emotion. And when we look at each other, we don't realize we do it, but our eyes, what they call left gaze, we shift just a hair. We don't even know we're doing it. And dogs are almost the only animal that does that when they look at us. There's a shift in their eyes. But a recent experiment actually showed that tame wolves also do that a bit. So it goes back to the origins of wolves and wolf packs, having that highly attuned sense of what's going on with the animals around them. So quite amazing animals. They operate in a world that we really don't necessarily know what they're feeling or experiencing. Now I'm going to take you really quickly through this. This is a Russian hunting dog. It's they call it a Borzoi. It was a fast-running hunting dog, and it was a functional dog because the Great Plains of Russia were open for game and so forth, so the dogs can run them down and catch them for the hunters, so they were a useful skill. They're also heavy-coated because of the long winters. But what happened was serfdom in Russia, very similar to slavery. These serfs were born to the land, and many of the upper classes had these huge estates, and they could afford these huge estates because they had all this free labor, somewhat similar to the southern plantations. And what happens with the idle rich? Well, they breed thoroughbred horses, collect fast racing cars, and in Russia, they bred fast hounds. And they figured they'd outdo the English because they used them also to chase down wolves. And they'd run these things. Leo Tolstoy has a description of a hunt with these guys in one of the chapters. And there'd be 100 dogs running on that thing out into the steppes of Russia. And because of that, the competition between these wealthy landowners became intense, and they were really the most intensively bred dog in the world as a single. There were 7 or 8 different types. They weren't just limited to one. But in 1851, the serfs were freed because they realized it couldn't kind of continue in the way it was going. Roughly 40% of the Russian population fell into the category of serf. But what they did was a little bit like the American Civil War. The serfs were freed by Alexander I via a 300-page document that was written by guess who? Well, the people in charge. And basically what they did, so just like the slaves in America, they operated within a system. Now, it was a very limited system, but they operated that the markets were controlled and things like that. So basically what happens when they were freed, they said, you're on your own. Oh, you don't have any education? Oh, and you don't have any money? Oh, well, so what? Well, in Russia, the serfs had a lot better, had an advantage over the American slaves. They looked like everybody else. And so they ended up sowing the seeds of the Russian Revolution. And when the Russian Revolution, well, when the serfs were freed, the estates shrunk down, and the Russian Revolution, they basically, it was all gone, and there was only a few fragmented. But in the in-between, late 1800s, some of these dogs were sent over to Russia, very few of them, and the first one arrived in the United States in 1889. Guess who that is? That's the captain of the Titanic and his dog, which they call a Borzoi. Luckily for the dog, he was not on the Titanic. Well, one thing about these dogs, they're very unusual. I didn't see them, and they're kind of the perfect Art Deco dog. So in the 20s, the Hollywood starlets said, oh, I look so elegant having these. And we even have the bathing beauties with their dogs. And obviously, this is carrying to the extreme. Says, I've got more dogs than you. But now I'm going to read you a poem by Rudyard Kipling. It's called The Power of the Dog. This was written in 1922. There is sorrow enough in the natural way from men and women to fill our day. And when we are certain of sorrow in store, why do we always arrange for more? Brothers and sisters, I bid you beware of giving your heart to a dog to tear. Buy a pup and your money will buy love unflinching that cannot lie. Perfect passion and worship fed by a nudge in the ribs or a pat on the head. Nevertheless, it's hardly fair to risk your heart for a dog to tear. When 14 years, which nature permits, are closing in on asthma, tumor, or fits, and the vet's unspoken prescription runs to lethal chambers or loaded needles, then you will find it's your own affair, but you've given your heart to a dog to tear. When the body that lived at your single will with its whimper of welcome is stilled, when the spirit that answered your every mood is gone, wherever it goes, for good, you will discover how much you care and will have given your heart to a dog to tear. We've sorrow enough in the natural way when it comes to burying Christian clay. Our loves are not given, but only lent, though it's not always the case, I believe, that the longer we kept them, the more we grieve. For when debts are payable, right or wrong, a short time loan is as bad as a loan. So why in heaven, before we're there, should we give our hearts to a dog to tear? And the 1-minute dog tour, then we'll have a short time for questions. This is Reggie. Why I like my dogs. They have long noses. They're perfect for getting the last potato chip out of the bag. They're soulful. They're sweet. They're happy. And they're tall. I am standing up here. They sleep a lot, everywhere. I gave up a long time ago saying, don't sleep on the couch, don't get up on the couch. And they guard you against attacking squirrels. But they're really handy around the house. They keep the kitchen counter clean. They keep the bed warm. And very, very best of all, they clean the toilets. So, but when all is said and done and the day is gone, when I have to say goodbye, my heart is broken. But sometimes when I look up in the sky, I can still see them racing like the wind. So, questions?
I love this. I have a tear in my eye, and I smiled, and I was watching other people. This was just a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you.
Wayne here. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I was spending time at my uncle's farm, and he always used snakes and cats to keep the mice down. One day while he was at work, I found a very large rat snake, brought it back, put it in a gunny sack, and when he came home, I put him out on the barnyard, and my uncle always had a pack of dogs, and the alpha dog, as I was reaching for the snake, he reached in and grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me back with a very gentle mouth, and just he thought, he recognized danger. I didn't, but.
Okay, I'm Sally Hopkins, and we happen to have 2 different basset hounds, and I didn't see a basset hound on there today. Not one. And they're very lovable dogs. We had the female, which was much smaller than the male, thank goodness. But we had one which was Princess Matilda of Kent. And then we had Princess Marguerite of Whitehall. And we happen to live in Whitehall. We happen to live in Kent. And they both are very British. But we love them.
I'm Ron, and have you been able to trace back where does the saying come from, a person has gone to the dogs?
No, I didn't trace that one back or anything. Well, maybe that's not such a bad thing.
This isn't much of a story, but I don't know, about 35 years ago, Jerry had neck surgery, and he's in a big brace, and we'd go downtown with our new little Wheaton Terrier puppy that had eyelashes that were at least an inch and a half long, curled up, and he was a cute little thing, looked just like a teddy bear. And I'd go into the store, and Jerry'd sit outside with the dog, and I'd come out, and there would be an entire ring of women around him, all oohing and awing and asking if they could come home with him and play with his dog. So there's nothing like a dog for a babe magnet. A puppy, there's just nothing like it.
2 things. I don't know, did anybody see the OPB whole hour on dogs about 3 nights ago? You might want to look it up. Had a few other facts. One, especially with the eyes, the dogs learn to follow human eyes, and then to where humans' eyes look and where they point. And so they learn to go get and fetch. And they haven't been able to train monkeys to do this. And if you saw that program, one dog could recognize 1,000 different items put before him, and with the name, so he knew 1,000 different words. Second question is, can dogs smell fear on humans?
Oh, yeah, I mean, because we're giving off various chemicals depending upon our emotions, or it can be joy or fear. They sense your moods. Many people have said that the dog, when they're feeling really low, the dogs, who usually is just bouncing around, will actually come up to them and being very quiet. So they part of that is just smelling the chemicals we give off with our emotions. Well, so dogs can sense aggression. I had some dogs that were not aggressive at all, but they could feel aggression, and then they would be much more protective.
The last time there was an earthquake in town, our dog knew about it before we did, because for some reason or other, he had this feeling that something was going to happen. He became very agitated, and we didn't know what was going on, and all of a sudden the earthquake occurred.
Yeah, there's some sense that the hearing, they can hear sounds of, that are a higher pitch that may be impending earthquake.
Well, this same dog turned out to be a seizure dog without training, but we discovered it because we had another dog who was epileptic. And he would wake us up just minutes before our other dog went into a seizure and get us up, and we would grab up our dog that had the problem. 10 minutes later, it was all over. And we were very thankful for that because it meant that we could keep our epileptic dog off of medication. And that was just fine with us.
I think it's time for a break. Boy, this is incredible, Paul. You did a huge amount of work. And you could have been the OPB special yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.